June 4th, 1942. The sun had just begun to rise over the small, windswept atoll of Midway in the North Pacific. The sea glistened, deceptively calm, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to taste. From the deck of the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky squinted against the early morning glare, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. Somewhere out there, concealed by the vastness of the ocean, was an enemy that had seemed invincible for 6 long months. Smoke still trailed from the direction of the Japanese carriers reported days earlier, but the real danger loomed unseen, thousands of feet above the water. On board the USS Hornet, another American carrier, Ensign George Gay tightened his flight harness, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below him, the flight deck was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Sailors hustled with urgent precision. Fuel lines hissed. Deck crews shouted over the roar of engines, and the sharp, distinct scent of aviation gasoline filled the air. Every man knew the stakes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, and Midway was the first real chance to strike back, to change the course of the war. High above the waves, the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Hiryu was a similar flurry of calculated activity. Captain Takeshi Koyanagi barked orders as dive bombers and torpedo planes were armed and prepared for another strike. The crews worked with a mechanical rhythm, every action drilled into them through months of relentless training. There was no sense of easy triumph, no arrogance, just the grim focus of men who understood that a single mistake could cost them not just the battle, but their lives. Beneath the ocean's surface, a different kind of tension unfolded. The American submarine USS Nautilus, patrolling near the island, adjusted its periscope depth. Its crew strained to catch the faintest sign of enemy movement through the narrow lens. For the men inside these steel hulls, the ocean was both a shield and a prison. Every second stretched into an eternity, each sonar ping carrying the weight of potential doom or a fleeting opportunity. They were the unseen hunters, waiting patiently in the dark. Back on Midway's fragile airstrips, the first American scout planes roared to life, their engines screaming against the dawn. Many of these pilots were barely out of flight school, their youth a stark contrast to the deadly mission ahead. Lieutenant Commander Lofton Henderson led his squadron of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers into the vast blue expanse, a tight formation that cut through the morning mist like silver arrows. Below them, the ocean mirrored the morning sky, a canvas of serene blue that hid the treacherous currents of war. In the Japanese fleet, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, surveyed his vast armada from the bridge of his flagship, the super battleship Yamato. His eyes were sharp, calculating, yet there was an unspoken tension in his posture. Intelligence had hinted at American forces in the region, but the details remained frustratingly vague. He had planned this operation as a decisive blow, a trap to lure out and destroy the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But now, a seed of doubt had been planted. Every decision, every maneuver, could tip the balance in a battle that would determine the Pacific's future. He had rolled the dice, and now he had to wait for them to land. Miles away, in a dimly lit operations room on Midway, a very different kind of admiral was also waiting. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, maintained a calm exterior that belied the storm about to unfold. On the tables before him, maps and charts were spread out, covered with pins and markers representing ships, planes, and predicted movements. A stunning intelligence breakthrough in the previous weeks, the cracking of Japanese naval codes, had given Nimitz the rare and precious gift of foresight. He knew the Japanese were coming. He knew Midway was the target. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. But he also knew the enemy's plan. The trap set for Midway was now a trap for the trappers. But knowing the plan was one thing. Executing a counterattack would require flawless courage and more than a little luck. The first clash was now just minutes away. In the cramped cockpit of his Dauntless dive bomber, Lieutenant Dick Best adjusted his goggles, feeling the powerful vibrations of the engine through the controls. He was one of the Navy's best, a man born to fly. Below him, the carriers of the Japanese fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, seemed impossibly distant and invincible, the heart of an empire's naval power, But as he peered through the haze, he could see them. And he could see the enemy planes beginning their ascent, their silhouettes against the rising sun like dark birds of prey. Every breath he took was measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of impending war. This was the moment they had all trained for, the moment that would define their lives. And then, it began. The serene morning was shattered. Smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of engines and anti-aircraft guns ripped through the air. The Battle of Midway had erupted, a sudden and violent storm that would, in the space of a few short hours, change the world forever. The fate of two mighty navies and the future of the Pacific War would be decided right here, in the skies and on the seas around this tiny, isolated atoll. June 4th, 1942. The mid-morning sun hangs over the vast Pacific, but the tranquility is shattered. A chaotic symphony of roaring engines, exploding shells, and frantic shouts fills the air. This is the Battle of Midway, and the fate of the war in the Pacific is being decided in these very moments. Plumes of black smoke rise from the fleets of both nations, painting a grim picture against the blue sky. From the decks of the American carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, dive bombers streak towards the Japanese fleet, their pilots laser-focused on a singular, critical mission. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky grips the controls of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber. His eyes are fixed on the Japanese carrier Akagi far below. As he pushes his aircraft into a steep dive, the world becomes a blur of speed and noise. Deadly fireworks of anti-aircraft flak erupt around him, puffs of black smoke marking near misses. Down on the Akagi's flight deck, it's sheer panic. Japanese sailors scramble for cover as the American planes descend like angry hornets. McClusky's bomb and those of his squadron find their mark. They rip through the flight deck, igniting fuel lines and stored torpedoes in a catastrophic chain reaction. Captain Takeshi Koyanagi's orders are lost in the deafening roar of explosions. Sailors dive for cover, but there is no escape as fire consumes the mighty carrier with terrifying speed. The thick, suffocating smell of burning gasoline and cordite fills the air, a grim testament to the unfolding destruction. At the same time, the battle rages from the opposite perspective. On the USS Yorktown, Ensign George Gay has just taken off. The adrenaline of launching from a carrier deck is still coursing through him when the ship's alarms blare to life. Japanese dive bombers are incoming. Gay and his wingmen twist and bank their planes in tight, desperate formations, dodging a hailstorm of tracers and falling debris from exploding aircraft. Bullets shred the air around them, a constant, terrifying reminder that a single misstep, a moment's hesitation, means a fiery death. Below them, the decks of the American carriers are a scene of organized chaos. Men move like a well-oiled machine, rearming and refueling planes, patching up damage, and sending pilots right back into the fray. Every man, from the deckhands to the pilots, understands the stakes. In this inferno, one pilot becomes a focal point of American resolve. Lieutenant Dick Best. Leading his division of dive bombers, he scans the ocean for a target. His eyes lock onto the Hiryu, the last of the four main Japanese carriers still operational. Its flight deck is a perfect target, its planes lined up, vulnerable and exposed. Best begins his dive, a gut-wrenching descent toward the enemy. He times his release perfectly. The bomb arcs down and strikes the carrier with devastating force. The explosion is catastrophic. Torpedo planes parked on the deck erupt in a secondary blast, and the entire carrier shudders violently from the impact. A massive column of smoke and debris shoots into the sky, raining down on the surrounding Japanese fleet and sending sailors scrambling for life rafts in the churning, oil-slicked water. Every second of this battle feels stretched into an eternity. Each heartbeat seems to echo the roar of gunfire and the scream of diving planes. The chaos is mirrored across the vast expanse of the ocean. Torpedo planes from the Japanese fleet, the dreaded Kates, swoop in low and fast, aiming for the vulnerable hulls of the American carriers. The USS Hornet and USS Enterprise brace for the onslaught. Their anti-aircraft gunners fire relentlessly, filling the sky with a deadly curtain of steel. The ships rock violently as near misses send towering plumes of water crashing over the decks, drenching sailors who are already soaked in sweat and fear. Amidst this maelstrom, every officer and sailor on both sides is forced to make split-second decisions that hold the power of life and death. But the battle isn't just being fought on the surface and in the air. Below the waves, American submarines move with tense, silent precision. The men inside are cramped, the air thick with anticipation. They strain against their periscopes, their eyes scanning the surface, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. As some Japanese vessels begin to maneuver to evade the relentless dive-bombing attacks, they sail right into the trap set by the American subs. Torpedoes are launched from the hidden depths, silent predators racing toward their targets. They find their marks with deadly accuracy, tearing into the hulls of Japanese ships and adding another layer of carnage to the already overwhelming scene. The element of surprise from below the surface adds to the chaos and further tips the scales. Amid this large-scale madness, countless small acts of heroism become the invisible backbone of the American effort. Pilots instinctively shield their wingmen from enemy fire, taking risks that defy self-preservation. On the carrier decks, sailors work under a constant rain of bombs and shrapnel, risking everything to rearm and refuel the next wave of planes. Medics move through the smoke and debris, their resolve unshakable as they pull the wounded to safety, treating injuries in the most hellish of conditions. Every man involved, from the highest-ranking admiral to the youngest sailor, knows this fight is about more than just personal survival. They are fighting for the future. This is the turning point of the Pacific War. As the morning wears on, the results of the American assault become brutally clear. The pride of the Japanese fleet, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, are burning wrecks, crippled beyond any hope of immediate repair. Their flight decks are twisted blackened steel, their hulls gushing smoke. The tide of the battle, once thought impossible to turn, is shifting. But the fight is far from over. The carrier Hiryu remains a potent threat, its surviving planes preparing for a desperate counterstrike that could still devastate the American fleet and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Across the water on the decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged but still fighting Yorktown, American sailors brace themselves. Their nerves are taut, their bodies exhausted, but their resolve is hardened by the devastation they have witnessed and inflicted. They know the next wave is coming. The Battle of Midway has entered its most critical phase. The outcome hangs precariously in the balance. Every explosion, every maneuver, and every second spent in the air or on the deck will continue to shape the destiny of the Pacific, and indeed, the world. By mid-afternoon, the sky over the Pacific was a canvas of smoke and fire. The plumes from the burning Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, merged into a single, vast, acrid cloud that hung heavy over what remained of the once mighty fleet. But the battle was far from over. Through the shimmering heat haze on the horizon, a new threat emerged. The ominous silhouettes of Hiryu's torpedo bombers. They flew low, slicing through the waves with deadly precision. This was Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, launching a desperate, vengeful strike. High above, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky and his pilots instantly grasped the danger. They knew these planes were aiming to even the score. Below them, on the deck of the USS Yorktown, chaos erupted. Alarms screamed alive as lookouts spotted the incoming torpedo planes. Ensign George Gay, already in the air, banked his fighter sharply to intercept, diving headlong into the fray. The sky exploded into a symphony of destruction. The roar of machine guns, the whine of stressed engines. It was a deadly ballet between predator and prey. On the American carriers, anti-aircraft gunners opened up, their tracer rounds stitching lines of light across the smoke-filled air. The first wave of Hiryu's dive bombers broke through. They struck the Yorktown with terrifying accuracy. Bombs slammed into the flight deck, unleashing a hellstorm of shrapnel fire and splintered steel. Sailors scrambled for cover, shouting orders over the deafening roar of explosions. The massive carrier shuddered violently as a bomb tore through its deck, igniting fuel lines and turning parked aircraft into infernos. The choking smell of burning oil and gunpowder filled the air, enveloping the crew in a thick, blinding haze. The Yorktown, a veteran of the Coral Sea, was fighting for its life, its crew battling fires and flooding even as the attack raged on. The Japanese pilots pressed their attack with a ferocity born of desperation. Torpedoes dropped into the water, churning white wakes as they raced toward the Yorktown's hull. The ship's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, ordered a hard turn, trying to comb the torpedo tracks. But the carrier was too large, too slow. Two torpedoes struck the port side, ripping massive holes below the waterline. The Yorktown listed heavily, its power failing, its engines grinding to a halt. The order was given: abandon ship. The valiant carrier, which had absorbed so much punishment, was finally silenced, dead in the water. But its sacrifice had bought precious time. Now, it was America's turn to answer. A call went out for the remaining dive bombers, and one name was on everyone's lips: Lieutenant Dick Best. He had already distinguished himself that morning by helping sink the Akagi. Now, he was being called upon to finish the job. Leading a patched-together squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, he climbed into the sky, his eyes fixed on the last target. Hear you. They found her quickly. Best and his men pushed their planes into a near-vertical dive, hurtling towards the Japanese carrier. The sky around them erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Puffs of black smoke from exploding shells dotted the air, and tracers zipped past their canopies. It was like flying through a curtain of steel. Best held his dive, his focus absolute, the carrier growing larger and larger in his sights. Every movement was a calculation against death itself. At the perfect moment, he released his bomb. Time seemed to stretch. For a few agonizing seconds, the 1,000-pound bomb tumbled through the air. Then, impact. A massive explosion ripped through Hiryu's flight deck, right near the forward elevator. A geyser of flame and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion buckled the deck, turning it into a twisted, burning wreck and igniting the aircraft being prepared for the next strike. Following Best's lead, the other Dauntless pilots rained down their deadly cargo. More bombs slammed into the carrier. One after another, explosions tore through her hull. Fires raged uncontrollably, consuming planes, ammunition, and fuel. On Hiryu's bridge, her captain, Tomeo Kaku, shouted orders, but it was useless. The once disciplined fleet was in disarray. Smoke blocked all vision. Radios crackled with confused and panicked messages. The heart of the Japanese Navy was being torn out. American pilots, their fuel and ammunition running low, refused to let up. They circled and strafed the burning wreck, ensuring the fires could not be contained, ensuring Hiryu could not recover. From the decks of the U.S. carriers Enterprise and Hornet, exhausted crews watched the spectacle. Every secondary explosion from the distant burning carrier brought a cheer. They were battered and bruised, but they were winning. Even beneath the waves, the battle continued. American submarines like the USS Nautilus had been shadowing the Japanese fleet, waiting for an opportunity. They launched torpedoes at cruisers and destroyers attempting to flee or protect their burning carriers. The ocean itself had become a killing field, a three-dimensional battlefield of aircraft, ships, and submarines. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, June 4, 1942, the last of Japan's frontline carriers was a blazing, sinking pyre. Hiryu, the flying dragon, slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the hopes of the Japanese Empire. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. In a matter of hours, a desperate gamble had transformed into one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The men of the U.S. Navy, pilots, sailors, gunners, were exhausted, scorched, and wounded. But as they watched the enemy fleet burn on the horizon, they knew they had achieved the impossible. They had met a superior force and broken its back through courage, skill, and a little bit of luck. The momentum of the war, once firmly in Japanese hands, now shifted to the United States. The Battle of Midway was over, and its outcome would echo through history, a testament to the fact that even against overwhelming odds, victory is possible. The sun bled into the horizon on June 4, 1942, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, a stark contrast to the grim scene below. The waters around Midway Atoll were no longer pristine. Instead, they were a graveyard, scarred with plumes of thick black smoke, slicks of oil that shimmered like dark rainbows, and the splintered debris of once mighty warships. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid metallic smell of fire and burnt metal, a suffocating reminder of the day's brutal whirlwind devastation. On the decks of the American carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, a new kind of battle was being waged. Sailors moved with a cautious, exhausted urgency. They were tending to the wounded, their quiet murmurs a stark contrast to the roar of battle just hours before. They worked to secure damaged equipment, patching holes and clearing away wreckage. preparing for any lingering threat that might emerge from the twilight. The furious adrenaline that had fueled them through the desperate fight began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the quiet, heavy weight of reflection. Standing near the bow of the Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky held his binoculars to his eyes, his knuckles white. He scanned the vast, darkening expanse of the Pacific, searching for any sign of the enemy. His uniform was scorched, his hands stained with grease and soot from helping with emergency repairs. He was a picture of the battle itself, battered but unbroken. Looking out at the scattered fires on the horizon, which marked the graves of Japanese carriers, a sense of profound awe settled over him. The Imperial Japanese Navy, a force that had seemed utterly invincible, that had swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed, had been crippled, decimated in a matter of hours. He allowed himself a brief, hard-won moment of satisfaction, a feeling immediately tempered by the sobering thought of the friends and comrades who had not survived the chaos. Meanwhile, on the heavily damaged but still floating USS Yorktown, Ensign George Gay leaned against the fuselage of his fighter plane. He had stared death in the face earlier that day, surviving a harrowing torpedo attack that had sent his own plane into the sea. He had watched the battle unfold from the water, a lone spectator to history. Now back on a friendly deck, his clothes were still soaked with salt water, his face streaked with grime. With every breath, he tasted the lingering smoke and the salt of the ocean. Around him, the crew spoke in hushed tones, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. They had faced the best pilots and the most powerful carriers Japan had to offer, and they had lived to tell the tale. Gay's thoughts, however, drifted to the friends he had lost in the fiery maelstrom, the empty seats in the ready room. The thin razor's edge margin between victory and annihilation pressed heavily on his shoulders. This victory had been bought with blood. Far from the immediate chaos, the psychological shockwave of the battle was already crashing down on the Japanese command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, now faced the ruin of his meticulously laid plans. He had sailed with the most powerful naval force ever assembled, confident in a victory that would crush the American spirit. Instead, his fleet was shattered. The loss of 4 of his best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was a catastrophe from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover. These ships weren't just steel and machinery. They were the very heart of Japan's offensive power, carrying with them the most experienced and skilled naval aviators in the world. In one single disastrous day, that corps was gone. For the first time since the war began, the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the Japanese Empire had not just been halted, it had been reversed. The Americans had proven something vital, that superior intelligence, audacious courage, and near-perfect timing could overcome a numerically superior and more experienced foe. Back on Midway's shores, amidst the wreckage of the island's defenses, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, convened with his staff. He had orchestrated this victory from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away, in a gamble that rested on the skill of his codebreakers and the courage of his men. His voice was calm and deliberate as he reviewed the after-action reports and the heartbreaking casualty lists. He acknowledged the incredible heroism of the pilots and sailors who had, against all odds, turned the tide. On the map spread across the table, old lines were erased and new ones were drawn. Strategies were revised. The next steps in the long, arduous Pacific campaign were being planned. But even in this moment of stunning triumph, Nimitz understood the brutal reality. The war was far from over. This day had revealed the incredible potential of American forces, but the Pacific Ocean remained a vast, deadly, and unforgiving battlefield. Across the damaged decks and smoldering hulks, individual stories of heroism were already becoming legends. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, who displayed incredible skill and nerve by leading the decisive dive-bombing attacks that sealed the fate of the Japanese carriers, were being hailed as heroes. Yet men like Best knew the truth. This victory wasn't the work of one man or one squadron. It was built on the collective courage of thousands, from the gunners who filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire, to the sailors in the engine rooms who kept the ships moving through hell. to the cryptanalysts in a windowless basement in Hawaii who had unlocked Japan's most secret codes. It was the synergy of intelligence, skill, and sheer raw bravery that had made the impossible possible. The American pilots had been outmatched in experience, their torpedo planes tragically obsolete, but they flew into the teeth of the enemy defenses anyway, pressing their attacks with a suicidal determination that ultimately created the opening for the dive bombers to strike. As night finally fell over Midway, the sea grew quiet, returning to an eerie calm that mirrored the star-dusted sky above. The only light came from the distant, angry glow of burning ships, funeral pyres that cast a somber, haunting beauty over the scene of destruction. In the quiet darkness, men stood at the rails of their ships, lost in thought. They were processing what had just happened, trying to comprehend the scale of it all. They were beginning to realize that the Battle of Midway was more than just a clash of steel and fire. It was a defining moment, a fulcrum upon which the entire war in the Pacific pivoted. It was a testament to strategy, a monument to sacrifice, and an enduring story of the unbreakable human spirit when placed under the most intense fire imaginable. By the end of that fateful day, June 4, 1942, the United States Navy had secured a victory so decisive, so complete, that its echo would ring throughout history. The core of the battle had lasted only a few short, frantic hours, yet its consequences would reshape the remainder of the Second World War. It proved that even in the darkest of times, when facing what seems like an invincible enemy, a combination of preparation, determination, and unwavering courage can defy all expectations and fundamentally change the course of history. The tide had turned, and the long, hard road to Tokyo had just begun. After the deafening roar of battle, a somber quiet settled over the waters of Midway. For the surviving American sailors, the work was far from over. They toiled relentlessly, their hands blistered, their bodies aching with exhaustion, patching up the wounds on their ships and recovering what they could from the debris-strewn sea. The Pacific was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams, a stark reminder of the battle's ferocity. Yet, amidst the grief for fallen comrades, a powerful sense of purpose burned bright. They had not just survived. They had been part of a moment that would echo through history. Back at his command post in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz absorbed the reports. The full scale of the victory was almost unbelievable. It wasn't just a military triumph. It was a testament to American resilience. The brilliant work of Codebreakers, who had unlocked Japan's most secret plans, had been the first critical piece. But it was the daring tactical gambles and the raw courage of every pilot and sailor that brought it all together. Nimitz saw it clearly. This synergy of intelligence, audacity, and bravery had just redrawn the map of the war. These were the lessons that would now guide every future operation, from the Solomon Islands to the shores of Japan itself. On the other side of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was reeling. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, now faced a disaster of his own making. 4 of his finest aircraft carriers, the very heart of his fleet, were gone. Hundreds of his most elite and experienced pilots, men who could not be replaced, now lay at the bottom of the ocean. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Japanese war machine was shattered. The myth was broken. For the Allies, fighting desperate battles across the globe, the news of Midway was a jolt of pure adrenaline. Hope, which had been in such short supply, was now surging. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stood on the flight deck, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He looked out at the tranquil sea, a stark contrast to the chaos of the preceding days. His mind replayed the critical moments, the desperate search for the enemy fleet, the split-second decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, the dive through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. He thought of the men who had followed him into that inferno, many of whom would never see another sunset. Each action, no matter how small, had woven together to create this incredible victory. In that thought, there was a profound sense of pride, but also a deep, solemn sorrow for the cost. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, became a living chronicle of the battle's human toll. He had watched the carnage unfold from the water after his own plane was shot down. His accounts, shared in letters and interviews, painted a visceral picture of the terror and chaos. He spoke not of grand strategy, but of the gut-wrenching fear, the blinding smoke, and the incredible acts of bravery he witnessed. His story, and countless others like it, reminded the world that battles are not just won by admirals and machines, but by the courage of individuals facing impossible odds. From the pilots in the sky to the medics in the sickbays, every person played a role, sung or unsung, in turning the tide. The Battle of Midway quickly became a legend, a textbook case study for military academies around the world. Strategists would pore over the details for decades to come. The intelligence coup that revealed Japan, his plans, the masterful coordination of air and sea power, and the leadership that enabled a smaller outmatched force to achieve such a decisive victory. It was a masterclass in how to defeat a seemingly unbeatable enemy. Historians, veterans, and scholars all agree, Midway was the pivot point. A few crucial hours in early June 1942 fundamentally altered the course of the Pacific War, shifting the momentum in favor of the United States. As darkness fell over the North Pacific, the stars emerged, reflected in the now calm waters. The men who survived that day carried the memories with them forever. The thunder of explosions, the smell of smoke, the sight of friends lost in an instant. But they also carried something else, the unshakable knowledge that their sacrifice had mattered. They had stared into the face of overwhelming odds and had not backed down. On that quiet night, surrounded by the ghosts of battle, one truth was crystal clear to every sailor and pilot. The Battle of Midway had proven that with bravery, with intelligence, and with unwavering resolve, even the most formidable challenges could be overcome and the course of history itself could be changed. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of courage and resilience as fascinating as we do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of history.